Hello, welcome to my channel. Have you ever wondered whether you as a person or your character could be considered virtuous? Whether the qualities that make you who you are hit the right mean between excess or deficiency? Or whether your life could be considered a life of eudaimonia? Probably not, but this guy did. And then this guy made a video about that guy. And now this guy is making a video about them. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Hope you enjoy. Since this is my first video, let me introduce myself. My name is Stan. I live in Belgium. And I have made this YouTube channel to talk about philosophical and scientific ideas that I find interesting or helpful. At the end of the video, I will talk a little bit more about what this channel is about more generally and why I made it. But for now, let's get on with the main topic. On December 16, 2019, Pewdiepie made a video titled, "I Hate Twitter." The video was less about Twitter than it was about Aristotle's theory of virtue, as Pewdiepie had read about in Aristotle's work, the Nicomachean Ethics. One question you may have about this is why a video titled "I Hate Twitter" talks about Aristotle rather than Twitter. This is because of the phenomenon of virtue signaling, something Pewdiepie talked about in the beginning of his video without explicitly mentioning the term. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept of virtue signaling, it's a concept that has gained popularity not too long ago in a common intellectual discourse. What it describes basically is when people make statements both in real life and online that seem to show some kind of moral quality. It can be, for example, when people make a statement that seems to convey concern for a discriminated minority group. A common example for this is companies changing their logo during Pride Month to convey their support for LGBT movements. However, the people who are doing the virtue signaling are presumed to not really put their money where their mouth is or being hypocritical. Now, next thing you need to know to understand why Pewdiepie ended up talking about Aristotle in his video about Twitter is Pewdiepie's interest in more philosophical or literary material that stems back to the beginning of 2018, where he made his first book review video. In his book review series, he reviewed philosophical works such as Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and Plato's Republic. So having an interest in Greek philosophy led him to Aristotle, which is famous for the term of virtue, and his dissatisfaction with Twitter and his hearing about the popular concept of virtue signaling, it's not hard to see why he put those together and kind of made a video that he did. Now, after having explained this to you, let me explain what led me to make a video about this. There are two reasons for this. One, that I'm enthusiastic about seeing more mainstream interest in engaging with philosophical intellectual material. And the second reason for making this video is because, coincidentally, I actually wrote my first practice philosophical paper in my first year of university about exactly this topic, about Aristotle's theory of virtue. Now, the thing I would like to comment on is the way in which Pewdiepie and people in general sometimes engage and think about philosophical works such as that of Aristotle. It seems to me like there is almost a kind of religiosity to how people regard these philosophers and their works. They don't see them as merely extraordinarily highly skilled thinkers that have come up with incredibly influential and insightful answers to very important philosophical questions. They're sometimes seen as something akin to divine prophets. Now, another place where you can find this kind of mindset is, for example, in how people sometimes appraise the great talents of history in other disciplines. Take, for example, the great artists of history such as Beethoven, Bach, or the Renaissance painters such as Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo. The artists and their works are seen as so unbelievably impressive that the only explanation for it being so impressive is that there are divine forces at work. So this is also how I kind of feel like how people think about the old Greek philosophers or just very famous old philosophers in general. It's important to keep in mind that no matter how great those works of art and music were, those artists were still just people, like you and me. So what it comes down to is that Aristotle is not a divine figure, but that he was just a human being that was extremely talented at thinking about philosophical issues. One symptom of this kind of mindset I feel shows in when people talk about these philosophers and their ideas as kind of answering the philosophical questions decidedly that they talked about, or that reading them is the only way to truly understand those philosophical questions. And the problem with most big philosophical questions, and especially those pertaining to the question of how we should live a good life or what it means to be a good human being, is either that they are so complex and so multifaceted that they will never be able to completely, fully be answered by one person, or that they simply do not have a clear answer, a mathematical true or false answer.
I find it kind of humorous with the never-ending self-help books that exist that still tries to answer this question today, when it was answered over 2,000 years ago.
Yes, Aristotle is helpful and interesting in trying to think about how you should live and what kind of person you should be. But so are modern philosophical works about these questions. I kind of feel like it plays on the intuition that questions such as what kind of person you should be or how you should live are too important to be up for discussion by just regular, common, everyday people or modern people, and need to be decided by these very famous, very old philosophers. And that way of thinking might prevent people from reading these modern philosophical works that can actually have real value to improve people's lives and help them become better people. Now, I'm sure that in the genre of self-help, there's a lot of books that are pretty negligible in terms of their value to understanding important life questions or trying to improve your life. But personally, the couple of self-help books that I've read, I found to be pretty interesting and pretty helpful in trying to grapple with some of life's most important challenges. I think it's important to distinguish to ask whether Pewdiepie meant that the works of Aristotle made all of self-help redundant, or whether he meant that where self-help books try to answer the question what in general sense it means to be virtuous has become redundant, which I feel self-help books are not really trying to do. So the difference is Aristotle tries to very elaborately define the concept of virtue using the golden mean and eudaimonia, where self-help books just implicitly assume a definition to virtue, which is usually just the qualities that make you happy or the qualities that are being desired by the reader, and try to answer how to attain those qualities. So yes, on the one hand, I would agree that self-help books aren't that useful in trying to define virtue in a broad sense, but that's also not really what they're trying to do. And on the other hand, if Pewdiepie were to claim that all thinking about how to attain specific qualities that are seen as virtuous by one definition or another have become completely redundant by Aristotle, then I would have to disagree. Furthermore, Aristotle tries to do both things in his book. He tries to find the most comprehensive definition of the term virtue, and he also tries to identify specific virtues or the most important virtues. For example, Aristotle goes more in depth on specific virtues such as courage or generosity. I think the main point of inquiry for Aristotle was trying to find the correct definition of this thing people talk about as virtue. And then secondly, to more closely analyze all the aspects that his definition entails. Now let me continue by talking about the difficulties you get when trying to define words like this. Also, something that is worth pointing out is the fact that virtue is not really something we talk about anymore these days, or at least not in the same way as they did centuries ago. Let me discuss a few ways in which this word is still used. The first sense is the one that is most closely to Aristotle, I feel, is when we talk about virtue as being the qualities that are supremely important for how to live a good life. What is specific about virtue in this sense is that it deals about things like overcoming suffering or great adversity in life, or dealing with disappointment or striving for success. In this sense, qualities such as self-reliance, perseverance, or responsibility will be crucial. But you will notice that this kind of talking about virtue is still not something you would find in common language settings. Which is not to say that you will merely not find it in everyday conversations and small talk, but also in more profound and deep discussions of contemporary people about these questions about important qualities in life. The word virtue will scarcely be used. And another sense in which you will find the word virtue being used this day and age is in what I would call the sense of benevolence, of being of goodwill. Let me give you an example. Say you're at a house party. You go to the bathroom and on the floor you find one of your female friends being passed out drunk. You wake her up, you make sure she's alright, and you call her a cab to take her home. Later, when talking to a friend about the event, he remarks, "It's a good thing you found her, and not somebody less virtuous as you." Virtue in this sense has little to do with how you live your life or how you would deal with adversity and such. It has more to do with what you would call your moral integrity, in that you are not the kind of person who would take advantage of someone else. And then the last way in which this word is still used that I'm going to discuss is, surprise, surprise, virtue signaling. So, as I explained earlier, virtue signaling is essentially pinning a medal to your chest that says, "I'm a good person because of X or Y." Now, the virtue in virtue signaling is essentially about doing something that is morally admirable. Now, this differs in a subtle way from the previous definition. In the house party scenario, just aims to convey merely that he has some moral integrity. Not that the amount of moral integrity that he has is praiseworthy, just that it could be worse. Where we talk about virtue in virtue signaling is that we are talking about a quality that is deemed admirable or praiseworthy, if even in just a very small amount, which was not part of the meaning conveyed in the previous example. Aristotle and Plato were famous for trying to find definitions for everything. There's this famous anecdote of Plato and Diogenes where Plato tries to define human being and defines it as a featherless biped, whereto Diogenes responds by bringing a plucked chicken to his lecture and saying, "Behold, a man," which I have noticed has become a meme recently. That conversation is part of a long-standing philosophical debate whether it is even possible to find clear, crisp definitions of difficult but even sometimes simple words. A famous example of this is, for example, the word anime and its difficulty in trying to unanimously find a definition for it. Because for every set of required qualities you list for some show to be considered an anime, you will find examples of shows you consider anime which do not adhere to the list, or things that do pass the test of the list that we would not consider anime. People assume that the meaning of language is just this one-to-one relationship of word definition, while from a non-linear, non-subjective point of view, language meaning is more like this big ball of wibbly-wobbly, wordy language stuff. Okay, that was like... By the way, the idea that finding crisp, correct definitions of complex words is impossible is not something that I've come up with. It is something that has been discovered by recent thinkers, most notably Wittgenstein. An important takeaway from this discussion is that I think a majority of the words we use have no clear definitions. The reality which we create psychologically and socially is so complex that there are just no simple definitions. So my reaction when I'm faced with a problem of definition like this is not to ask what is the true definition, but just analyze the different kind of definitions that we give without assuming one of them to be the true one. So let's do exactly that with Aristotle's definition of virtue, because the word virtue is such a complex word and has so many different meanings that there really cannot be found one true definition. Now, one big problem that I have about Aristotle's thinking about these matters, Aristotle's thinking about virtue is based on the idea that humans have been put on this world with a kind of essence and a kind of objective purpose. The word virtue, or in ancient Greek arete, is a word that is used not specifically for human qualities that are important in some way, but can be used for any object that has a specific function. And when it executes that function with excellence, it's considered virtuous. Now, this led Aristotle to believe that human beings also have some kind of objective function or purpose that we can adhere to with excellence, and that is what we would call virtue. Now, the problem is a contemporary way of thinking about what it means to be human and how the world works is in contradiction with this kind of notion of objective purpose. The broad philosophical worldview that I'm talking about is usually called scientific materialism. Scientific materialism is the idea that everything in our universe is ultimately the result of matter and the laws of nature. That is not to say that every phenomenon that we can identify consists of material stuff. Things like art or friendship or consciousness or war or society or the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. These things do not consist of physical material stuff, but what is responsible for them existing or for our consciousness to recognize them as such is because of natural processes. And it's because of the discoveries and insights that science has provided us with in the last few centuries that we are beginning to understand these natural processes that are behind the bewildering complexity of our world. Take, for example, the existence of life, of biological organisms. It's only through the biological scientific fields of study in recent centuries that we've been able to make real sense of what it is actually essentially about. The centuries before, the modern scientific fields of biology, being among others microbiology, genetics, evolutionary biology, without the major insights that these scientific fields have given us, we had no way of making sense of the biological world without thinking of life and living creatures as having some kind of supernatural essence that puts it apart from dead, unorganic matter. Or better yet, in case of humans and animals, of having some kind of soul. But now we know that the thing that makes living things is that they are the result of tiny molecular replicators that we call DNA that is capable of over time creating very complex structures, plants, animals, humans, without there having to be any kind of divine or supernatural elements part of the equation. And the non-scientifically informed way of thinking about life usually leads someone to believe that life has some kind of divine origin or objective purpose. And this kind of reasoning you will find being used by Aristotle, who lived way before the modern discoveries in the biological sciences. Let me put it in another way. If Aristotle would see a beaver, he would more or less reason that a beaver is a creature that has some kind of essence that makes it build dams. And that therefore building dams is this creature's objective purpose, that is what it's supposed to do. And going further, by using the logic of virtue, Aristotle would reason that a good beaver is a beaver that is most capable of building dams. Where an evolutionary biologist would see a beaver as just another way its genes have come up with unintentionally of making more copies of itself. I say unintentionally because genes don't try to make as many copies of themselves. Genes create such complex structures like beavers because of the process of natural selection, which sort of mimics an intentional designer. Just by a long process of a sort of trial and error caused by genetic mutations, create these magnificent things like animals or plants or humans without endowing them with some kind of essence or some kind of objective purpose. Always a good example of this objective purpose reasoning is the Catholic Church's objection with contraception. They reason that because human beings seem to have been designed to, reproduce, it is therefore our divine purpose to do so. And that's the reason why a good Catholic always goes in wrong. Okay, now let me make my final point to wrap this up. The more general overarching question what I've set out to answer in this video, whether Aristotle's theory of virtue decidedly answers big philosophical questions about life, such as what kind of person you should be or how you should live your life. I've explained how the correct defining of the concept of virtue was problematic, as I find that his rigid approach to semantics doesn't take into account the more complex and dynamic nature of language. Something that I find is better understood by modern philosophers and linguists. Secondly, the underlying philosophical worldview by which he understands living organisms is not really up to date with modern biology. For me, this means that taking Aristotle's teaching as a whole packet and shoving it into those big multifaceted problems such as what kind of person you should be and what kind of life you should live is not a good idea. Furthermore, I would like to add that even if Aristotle didn't have these problems, the question of how you should live or what kind of person you should be is not a question that has an answer like why is the sky blue. Thinking about and finding ways of answering these questions is a never-ending enterprise, so that one person or one school of thought can never have the final say on these matters. That being said, I do want to apologize to my boy Aristotle here, because originally this video was also going to be about the ideas of Aristotle that I found good and helpful. But the few problems that I tried to address first turned out to take up all of my time. At the beginning of the video, I talked about the concept of eudaimonia and the idea of virtue being the mean between an excess and a deficiency, or a golden mean as Aristotle calls it. And I think these ideas and concepts are definitely something I would like to go more in depth about, but that's going to have to be for another video. So I apologize to anyone who was watching this video dying to hear me speak about them. Always leave your audience wanting more. Furthermore, I would like to say something more about the fact that this video was in part about criticizing some things Pewdiepie said in his take on Aristotle. I want to stress that I have no negative attitude towards Pewdiepie or the way that he talked about Aristotle or philosophy in general, nor do I think he did a bad job. He merely said some things that I had my disagreements with, and I thought that maybe my comments on them might be interesting for those who watch this video. Or maybe Pewdiepie himself, but I doubt that Senpai will ever notice me. And on my part, I also welcome any good faith criticisms about the things that I said, about things that I may have overlooked or maybe flaws in my reasoning. In good faith is a key word here. I think it's hilarious that this kid is talking shit about Aristotle. He's jacked. Not only that, he wears the freshest blankets, goes to the chillest amphitheaters, and hangs with the hottest dudes. I think it's sometimes easy to forget in our current day world filled with internet debates, snarky Twitter comments, and Ben Shapiro's owning people with fact and logic left and right, that it's also possible to have a lighthearted discussion about intellectual topics without anybody trying to assert intellectual dominance or even moral dominance over the other person. If I disagree with someone, that doesn't have to mean that I think they're stupid or that I think they are a bad person. It just means that I disagree with them. And I think it's always possible that I might be wrong, so I'm always interested to hear responses to the things that I say that might point out to me how and why that I'm wrong. And that's all I have to say about that. For now. Thank you so much for watching my first video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want, you can stick around for this last small segment where I talk about my reasoning behind this channel and why I made it. If not, hope to see you in my next video. Have a nice day. And also, I've always wanted to say this. Please like and subscribe. This channel has been a major project of mine that I've been trying to get on the road for quite some time now. I've been molding and crafting it in my mind ever since I decided to drop out of university a few years ago. I studied a somewhat particular course that was called Moral Sciences, that tried to combine philosophy and modern human sciences, mostly aimed at better understanding questions surrounding ethics and the phenomenon of morality. I completed about half of it, but I had to call it quits due to health problems. On top of that, I also felt like I wanted to be more in charge in the things that I studied. There were particular intellectual domains that I find myself more inclined towards in trying to understand some philosophical problems, not least of which was the field of evolutionary biology and psychology, which I've been studying extensively ever since I quit university. One of the ideas behind this channel is that the ideas and intellectual material that I've studied in university and on my own is probably of interest and helpful to a much wider audience than just the highly educated. We all make our way through this very confusing world, and most people sooner or later find themselves confronted with more profound intellectual or philosophical questions. But it's very much not straightforward to look for answers, as there are many places where one could look, and many of which contradict with each other. Things like, what should I do with my life? Or why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? Or how does my brain work, and why does it stop working when I talk to my crush? And one of my favorite questions, why are people always so mean to each other? But also, why are people sometimes good to each other? I like to differentiate intellectual and philosophical material in two domains. On the one hand, there is the objective knowledge domain. Here are the questions of human nature, the workings of our psychology, the origin of our species, the rules of logic, and the proper way of doing science. And on the other hand, there is the domain that I call life philosophy. Here are the questions of how to be happy, how to find meaning in life, or how to improve society. These questions do not have true or false answers, as the questions in the objective knowledge domain do, but answers where we come up with them do vary in quality and can be evaluated on their merit. At the end of the day, it's those life philosophy questions that interest me the most, because it's there where we are looking for ways of improving our own and other people's lives. And what is important to keep in mind is that to answer those life philosophy questions as well as possible, it's crucial to have a good grasp on all the relevant facts and ideas that are part of the objective knowledge domain. For example, for the life philosophical question of how you attain happiness, it's probably interesting to know about the evolutionary origin of our brain and that it most likely operates in a way that doesn't stay too happy for too long with any accomplishment, because resting on your laurels is, evolutionarily speaking, a bad idea regarding to reproducing as much as possible. So dissatisfaction with whatever we've attained keeps kicking in to make sure we're doing everything we can all of the time that is likely to increase our reproductive fitness, our ability to reproduce as much as possible. even if that makes us miserable. So what I'm saying is that knowledge and thinking skills in both domains are crucial in trying to come up with approaches and solutions to the problems and struggles we all come across in our life's journeys. So in this channel, I hope to use sound reasoning and the best science available to me and the ideas of great thinkers, both old and new, to try and help you with that. But that's been it for me today. Hope to see you in my next video, but if you'll excuse me, I need to go make dinner. Oh, and by the way, this is Bubble. She's a whale shark.